Welcome to the Action Campaign's video series explaining legislative provisions of the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act of 2021. In this video, Jennifer and I will discuss how the legislation simplifies and improves the housing credit student rule. Jennifer, can you tell me about the student rule and the challenges it is causing for housing credit residents and property managers?
I'd be happy to, Ariane. When Congress created the housing credit, it wanted to make sure the program wasn't used to develop dormitory housing for full-time students, and it didn't want college kids to be able to live in housing credit properties as off-campus housing if their parents could afford to pay for their apartments. So Congress put in place a rule that barred households made up entirely of full-time students from living in a housing credit property. Over the years, Congress has enacted a number of exceptions to the student rule, but it still has the unintended result of preventing low-income residents of housing credit properties from going back to school to get a degree, which can be essential for them to eventually build more assets and ensure self-sufficiency.
Wait, so are you saying that someone living in a housing credit property who wants to go back to school to change careers would have to go part-time or else they'd lose their home?
That's exactly what I'm saying, unfortunately. It has caused a lot of unintended consequences.
So does HUD have a similar rule?
Yes, but the HUD student rule only applies to students under the age of 24. The HUD student rule also has some exceptions that differ from those under the housing credit student rule. And there are some other differences as well. The housing credit student rule only applies to full-time students, whereas the HUD student rule also applies to part-time students. Also, a single adult in a HUD property can make the whole household ineligible, whereas under the housing credit student rule, all household members must be students in order for the household to be ineligible.
That sounds really confusing, especially as we know that a vast majority of the housing credit properties have some HUD funding in them too. So what happens in those cases? Do you have to comply with both the housing credit and the HUD student rules?
Exactly. It's very confusing for tenants and for property managers. A household might qualify under the HUD student rule, but not under the housing credit student rule, or vice versa.
So how does this bill fix that problem?
First of all, rather than complying with two different student rules, properties financed with both housing credit and HUD programs would only need to comply with the HUD student rule. Second, the bill replaces the existing housing credit student rule with a simplified rule that would better achieve Congress's intended purpose. Like the HUD student rule, the new housing credit student rule would only apply to adult students under the age of 24, but it would still only apply to full-time students and not part-time students, and a household would only be ineligible if all household members were students.
So are there any exceptions under this new housing credit student rule?
There are. Full-time all-student households would still be eligible to live in a housing credit apartment if a household member is a single parent, was a formerly homeless youth, or a person who aged out of the foster system. There are also exceptions if a member of the household was a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault, covered by the Violence Against Women Act, a victim of human trafficking, or a veteran.
So where can we find this in the bill?
It's in Section 203.
Thanks, Jennifer. For more information on our video series, visit the Action Campaign's website at www.rentalhousingaction.org.